This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
The AFLW Grand Final has come around again, and it's the Kangaroos and Brisbane that are going to duke it out for the flag this year. And as the newish competition develops, there's plenty happening off-field. So in this Squiz Shortcut, we'll take a look at how the league is tracking, the challenges it's facing, and where it might go in the future. Squiz Shortcuts is the backstory to the big news stories. I'm Andrew Williams.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
Claire, for those that aren't Aussie Rules fans, the sport has a long and storied history in WA, South Australia, Victoria and Tassie, the Northern Territory as well. It's completely dominant in the sports pages and quite often the news pages, particularly during the winter months.
Yeah, and that, of course, is when the men's competition is on. It's been on for many a year now, and that competition continues to go from strength to strength. The TV ratings and the attendances at the games are really healthy. They've found new and interesting ways to commercialise the sport and also provide content to hungry AFL fans who just can't get enough of it. But that's not to say that they haven't been without their struggles, of course, particularly with their new clubs like the Gold Coast Suns and also Greater Western Sydney Giants.
Yeah, the Gold Coast haven't made the finals yet in over a decade of trying, and the Greater Western Sydney Giants are still struggling for crowds. But for the most part, though, as you said, it's going really well. And in 2017, the first season of the women's competition kicked off. At that time, it was just an 8-team competition to begin with. For comparison, the men's is 18 teams, soon to be 19 with the inclusion of Tasmania. And it kicked off at Icon Park in Melbourne with a game between Carlton and Collingwood in early February.
Yeah, so I reckon, Andrew, as an AFL buff, you've probably got a story to tell about that.
Yes, so almost accidentally. So I was actually in Melbourne with friends that day and we had other plans, but they fell over. So we made a last minute decision. We'll go see the first ever AFLW game. That'll be a nice thing to, tell people. And we quickly realised on the way there, no way we're getting in. The trams were full to the brim of fans heading to the ground. And it turned out that the game was a sellout. All the seats are gone. And hundreds of fans were actually locked out of the ground. The AFL CEO at the time, Gillon McLachlan, had to apologise.
I do remember that in the news, actually. It was quite a big start for the AFLW and also evidence, I guess, for people who were really looking for it, that there was an appetite for women's sport in the community and AFL particularly. The first few seasons had great attendance and the on-field standard, look, it started off a bit patchy, but it's continually improved, especially at the top end of the ladder. So those few teams who are really been in it for a while and they've been going from strength to strength too. The amount of scoring shots per game is on the rise, although that hasn't always meant higher scores. And Andrew, you're going to explain that that's due to accuracy issues.
Yeah, so for the uninitiated in AFL or not Australian rules football, if you kick a goal, you get 6 points. But if you miss to the either side of the goal, you just get 1 point. So you might get a scoring shot, which is a good thing because it means that more goals could be scored. But if you keep missing, it doesn't mean the scores are necessarily going to be higher. And what audiences generally want are higher scores. Some of the players are becoming superstars if they're not already. Like Ebony Marinoff, who won the Best and Fairest award this week, is just a great personality off the field and an unbelievable player on it as well. Ash Riddell, who finished second in that count, she's incredible. And there's also people like the very polished media performer, if you've ever seen her speak, and the on-field star Ellie Blackburn from the Bulldogs as well. They are creating stars.
Yeah, and I guess a sign of investment in the game. The average salary of the players has also gone up. In the most recent pay deal, it almost doubled, so from $46,000 to $82,000.
And that's paid right across a league that has expanded from 8 to 18 teams in just a handful of seasons. So they're paying that to a lot more players. And the 2024 season's grand final is a sellout. So there's some good stuff happening. But up next, we're going to look at some of the challenges that the league is facing, including a stagnation in fan support and how they might be able to recover that initial burst of momentum. Claire, while the on-field standard at the upper echelon, as you said, of the AFLW is very strong, it is facing some challenges that are becoming a real concern for the league. The first reared its head last year when analysts noted that TV ratings for the AFLW had dropped 70% from season 1, and that's a trend that hasn't been rectified in 2024.
Yeah, certainly as far as the reports go, there isn't actually a lot of data available on that, but that's certainly what has been reported. We know more, I guess, about attendance at the games. That's also dropped by 60% from season one. This year, they're slightly up on the year before, but those numbers did factor in a double header game. So those were women's games played before or after men's games, which had over 20,000 people at the ground. So by far and away, the most people turned up to watch those games in any of the games played this year.
That's right, but the average attendance is down to about 2,000 a game from 6,000 in the first few seasons. And I guess the thing to keep in mind there is there are many more teams and many more games to spread the fans out through. So that leads us to two questions. The first is, how does that compare with the other sports?
Yep, other sports are always a bit of a benchmark to see what others are doing. So let's look at the NRLW. So rugby league, the women's comp there, it started a year later than the AFLW. They're doing about the same when it comes to that engagement, but they also have State of Origin, and that had more than 20,000 fans show up to all three games of that series. The AFLW doesn't really have a showcase like that.
No, and then you've got the WBBL, which has the advantage of international interest because cricket is an international sport. That's currently running as we speak. That also does about as well in attendance, but it does particularly well in TV ratings. And then there's netball, which has grown its average attendance this year by 1,000 people per game, from around 5,000 to 6,000. It is Australia's most popular women's domestic league. AFLW is second.
Yep, netball is very popular with Australians, that's for sure. So it's probably fair to say that the AFLW is doing just okay at the moment. It's steadied, but it's not growing significantly. And as we talked about, those numbers are down. There's actually a clause in the players' deals with the league that says that the average crowd needs to get back to 6,000 across the competition in order to trigger the season expanding from 12 to 14 games.
And the players want that because that means they'll earn more money. So that leads us to the second question, which is, if the AFL administration wants to grow the women's league, when is the best time to play it?
So the first bunch of seasons started in February, but the last few have started in August. So there's more of a crossover with the men's game. And that brings us back to the question of double headers. A women's game played either as a curtain raiser or following the men's game. That's been floated a lot as a good way to grow the fan base.
The issue there is that the long-term goal of a women's competition is to build it as a standalone thing, not as a secondary comp to the men's, not as an entree to what people might consider the real thing. The WBBL is really trying to avoid that. That's why they are not moving from November, because they don't want to cross over. They want to build on their own. For the moment, the AFLW is sort of having a bob each way, starting during the men's season and then finishing well after. And this year, they also had a compressed fixture.
Okay, so Andrew, you're going to have to explain a compressed fixture.
So basically, AFL men's and AFL women's is always played on the weekend. It's grown earlier. It's sort of branched out to Thursday nights and Monday nights, but generally Friday, Saturday, Sunday is when we understand football is to be played. But in this most recent season of AFLW, they played on Wednesdays and Tuesdays. There was sort of a game every day in some periods. And that resulted in confused fans. They didn't know when the games were on, and some of them started at 5 p.m, which was difficult to get to because you couldn't head straight off after work. And people also claimed that compressed fixture, the games happening more often, caused a drop in the game quality and potentially as well injuries to players because they were playing more often. The players themselves didn't like it. And while the AFL footy chief, Laura Kane, did say she thought it worked, they have since scrapped it. Next year, it'll start in August again, and they're just going to play a nice and simple 12 rounds, 12 weekends. But Kane said that may still include some more double headers. So they are looking at that as an option.
Yeah, I'm glad you've explained that, because it has been a big talking point this year and I haven't quite understood what that all means, but that does sound quite confusing. So it's interesting that they're changing that. So we're going to have to see how that pans out in 2025. It's probably important to note too that struggling crowds and ratings isn't just something that the AFLW is dealing with, particularly post-COVID when we had lots of time in our hands and many people were locked down and were really keen to engage with sport. But the current off-field trend isn't in this sort of solid arrow going up at the moment, and that's where they'll want to get to. And that's a massive thing because attendances at the games and also viewership on TV is what pays for it.
Yep, and they want it to keep going. So that's our shortcut on AFLW. On to our recommendations. Each week we like to give Squizzes recommendations for further reading, watching and listening on the topic. Claire, I'm going to recommend an episode of The W Show that they publish on the AFL website with the gun journo, Sarah Black, who's well worth reading, and Ellie Blackburn, who I mentioned earlier. They have a chat about the state of the game from people who kind of watch and consume everything to give you the whole story. It's worth a watch.
Yeah, good one. I'll have a look at that. I'm going to recommend watching the AFLW Grand Final. So that is on Saturday. It's at 7:45 p.m. Andrew, you tell me the first AFLW final that's been played at night.
Yes.
So that's exciting. That's obviously Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. It's on Channel 7, it's on Fox Footy and it's on Kayo.
And you'll probably be able to hear it on ABC Radio as well, I imagine, if you want to listen to it. So I'll put links to all of those in the episode notes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember to share this episode with your mates who want to hear the backstory to the big news stories. And don't forget, of course, if you've got an idea for a future Squiz Shortcut, we love to hear them and we love to hear from you. So just flick it through to hello@thesquiz.com.au. Until next time.